You recognize the moment before it happens. The crowd is cheerful. The numbers look clean. Everyone is suddenly making sense of it. And then the music stops, and you realize you were participating in a promise you never actually agreed to. This is the hidden mechanism behind scams that dress up as miracles, not just the Mississippi bubble, not just paper money. The deeper truth: people don't lose money first, they lose judgment. And once judgment collapses, the entire system can pull the same stunt again and again with new outfits, new apps, new language, and the same human weakness underneath. Welcome to the hidden self, where we stop pretending that lies are harmless. We're going to walk through John Law and the Mississippi bubble, and then we're going to drag its modern shadow into the room with your bank account, your salary, your debt, your investments, and your quiet acceptance of rules that never asked your permission. Because what happened in France was not random, it was a blueprint. And the scariest part is that the blueprint didn't disappear in the 18th century. It got refined, it got automated, it learned to hide behind paperwork, policy, charts, and polite voices on television. By the time most people notice the trap is already holding them by the throat, and they can't even explain how they got there. So let's start with a simple question that should offend you. Why would anyone trade real value for paper that can be created on command? In 1694, in a cold, foggy night that felt like it was made of breath and regret, a man named John Law killed, not in some distant battlefield romance, not in a heroic duel with honor. It was raw, desperate violence. He was a gambler, a thrill seeker, someone who lived by impulse and appetite. He escaped punishment. He ran from one place to another, switching identities and cities like cards. And when you hear this, your brain wants to turn it into a story about evil, but don't. This is not only about evil, it's about pattern. A man who can't tolerate the limits of consequences will eventually build systems that remove consequences for himself and shift them onto everyone else. That's the psychology. The man becomes a mathematician only after he learns that people can be persuaded through fear, fantasy, and trust. He learned that the crowd does not need truth. The crowd needs momentum. Years later, in Amsterdam, Law watches a banking world that looks civilized on the surface. He sees gold being deposited, and then he sees paper receipts issued against that gold. But then he notices something that breaks the fairy tale. The amount of receipts circulating in public is far larger than the amount of gold sitting safely in storage. There should be collapse. There should be panic. The system should topple like a bad bridge. So he asks the question that most people refuse to ask because it would ruin their comfort. Why doesn't it collapse? The banker's answer, if they could speak honestly, would be because people keep believing. Because trust is not a feeling here. It's a structural force. People accept the paper because they think they can convert it later. They convert it because they think others will convert it. And that feedback loop is what keeps the machine running. Law's revelation is simple and terrifying. Money is not the metal. Money is the promise. The metal is cold and heavy. It doesn't care if you love it. It doesn't care if you're loyal. But a promise can be extended, renewed, decorated, and sold. A promise can inflate. A promise can be used to extract labor and resources without producing anything new. If the promise is convincing enough, you can manufacture wealth from belief. And notice what that does to the hidden self. It attacks a core human desire to believe that we are safe because we are reasonable. In daily life, you may think you're cautious. You read terms and conditions. You double check. But when it comes to systems larger than yourself, most people surrender their skepticism. They outsource thinking to authority. They confuse regulation with safety. They confuse tradition with truth. That's why someone like Law could become a savior in Paris. Not because he was holy, because he offered a narrative that soothed desperate minds. You can pay debts without gold. You can keep the economy alive using promises printed at scale. You can transform paper into power. Let's drop the historical costume and put the mechanism into your modern language. When a society is starving, people don't demand purity. They demand relief. And relief can be conjured by anything that creates the sensation of immediate liquidity. Law arrives when France is exhausted. The Sun King is dead. Wars and luxury have drained the treasury. Common people are dying while the elites dance on the edge of a corpse. The government is empty. The economy is bleeding. And when governments bleed, they eventually turn to the easiest wound-closing tool: printing. Printing is a drug. It looks like salvation because it makes numbers move. It makes payments possible. It makes payroll feel less impossible. It makes the streets calm for a moment. For a while, it's like giving oxygen to someone drowning. Law proposes a miracle. Instead of relying on gold, France will use paper money to pay taxes, fund trade, and restart circulation. He tells the regent and the court, you don't need gold to pay debt. You just need the public to accept paper as if it were gold. This is not a technical idea. It's a psychological campaign. Paper becomes sacred when enough people treat it like truth. And that's why the early stage of bubbles is always intoxicating. The machine works at first because belief does what mechanics can't. It accelerates transactions. People spend faster. Businesses hire. Merchants import goods. The ports fill with ships because credit feels available. The farmer buys seed. The tailor buys cloth. Everyone gets pulled into the same story. The economy is moving again. Therefore, the system must be legitimate. Then the second stage arrives. The stage where the narrative turns into religion. Law is not merely implementing policy. He is branding destiny. He's promoted as the man who resurrects France. He holds authority at the intersection of money and hope. And in that position, a gambler becomes a controller of temptation. He doesn't stop at paper currency. He builds a public fantasy that can be sold, traded, and expanded. Enter the Mississippi Company. He creates a monopoly trade company tied to Louisiana in the New World. He sells the vision, vast natural riches, gold everywhere, land that turns into fortune with one lucky bend of the body. He paints a paradise so vivid that Paris starts to feel like a doorway to heaven. But here is what makes this psychologically brutal. The paradise doesn't need to be real for it to be valuable. It only needs to be believed loudly, collectively, and quickly enough to attract new buyers before the story collapses, because the price of speculative assets doesn't reflect current production. It reflects expected future belief. Louisiana, in reality, is swamp and disease. It's not a treasure chest, it's a difficult environment. There's no immediate gold stream waiting to be scooped into pockets. But the crowd doesn't want facts. The crowd wants a shortcut out of humiliation. It wants a way to become rich without enduring boring reality. Paris transforms into a trading floor that behaves like a theater for collective hunger. Imagine it. Thousands pushing, trampling, shouting, crying. Nobles, priests, sex workers, servants, everyone throwing their fear and desire into the same market. The social hierarchy dissolves not because people become enlightened, but because greed is a universal solvent. It melts manners. It makes people act like animals with perfect coordination. And then you see the birth of a modern word in spirit. Even if you didn't have the exact label back then, millionaires are born from the air, from nothing that resembles actual work, from the moment a paper certificate becomes a claim on a future price increase. Law watches from above, and he sees power. Absolute power is not being rich. Absolute power is being able to direct the crowd's belief. He can print money and use it to buy further speculation, which boosts asset prices, which boosts belief in the currency, which boosts more speculation. It's a closed loop, a feedback system. In today's terms, it's capital being recycled into itself, while the public experiences rising prices as proof of legitimacy. And in both centuries, the trick is the same. They make the outcome look like evidence that the process is sound. Then the universal law wakes up, the one that nobody wants to hear because it destroys fantasies. What rises too fast falls hard. By late 1720, cracks appear. Some investors, either intelligent or cowardly, decide to cash out. They take their paper certificates and demand gold. They test the promise under pressure. This is where faith meets reality like a fist. At first, the bank pays. It can pay because there is some gold stored, and because not everyone attacks the promise at once. But then the crowd learns. Suspicion spreads. People whisper, then shout. They ask why they hold paper that can be printed while gold stays hidden. They ask where the promised gold from Louisiana actually is. The story collapses into the simplest truth. The riches were a narrative, not a supply chain. Panic is contagious. It's faster than logic. A rumor becomes a stampede. People who were celebrating yesterday become predators today. Banks get surrounded. Windows break. Screams replace laughter. Some die in the crush near the very institution that was just yesterday celebrated as savior. And this is where you see the real violence of bubbles. It's not only about money evaporating, it's about human character exposed. People become desperate. They become willing to hurt. Because when trust breaks, dignity breaks with it. Food prices explode. Bread becomes luxury. Some commit suicide because they lose everything and cannot imagine a future where the fantasy was wrong. Law, the architect, the gambler, the charismatic manipulator of belief, becomes the hunted man. He flees like the guilty always flee from the crowd they fed. He dies poor, isolated, in Venice years later. So what? You might be thinking, yes, fascinating history. But then you open your wallet and realize you live in a system built on the same psychological foundation, just with cleaner packaging. This is where we stop treating the Mississippi bubble like a museum artifact and start treating it like a design pattern. Your money is mostly paper or digits. It's not backed by gold. It's not backed by anything tangible you can hold in your hand. It's backed by the government's ability to enforce taxation and the central bank's willingness to manage liquidity. That's it. The value rests on trust in institutions, not on metal. When Nixon ended gold standard convertibility in 1971, the world shifted into the modern framework that behaves like law's system, fiat currencies, created and managed at scale. Dollars, euros, yen, these aren't gold claims. They are claims on future economic behavior. Their stability depends on confidence that the system will not implode. You may say, of course it works. Look at how long it has lasted. That's a trap. Because longevity is not proof. Longevity is proof of management and delayed consequences, not proof of truth. Here is the hidden mechanism that people never say out loud. When central banks create more money without creating more real goods and services, they dilute the purchasing power of existing money. That's inflation, and it doesn't arrive like a meteor, it arrives like a slow infection. And it behaves in a way that feels morally unfair because it is morally unfair. Money printed first doesn't land in your kitchen. It lands in the places closest to financial institutions. It lands in bank reserves, in asset markets, in wealthy investors who have access to credit and speed. When new liquidity enters, it tends to drive up asset prices before wages fully adjust. That timing creates a transfer, a quiet legal extraction. People who already own assets gain. People who rely on wages lose purchasing power. This is how inequality grows even when everyone is told to believe in fairness. This has a name in economics, but you don't need the academic label to understand it emotionally. The poor and middle class experience a price rise through daily life. The rich experience the price rise through investment gains and asset ownership. The sequence matters. The hidden self is the part of you that knows this doesn't feel random. It feels like you're running faster just to stay still, like the finish line is moving. You might even call it bad luck, because admitting it's structural feels too helpless. But the truth is colder. The system taxes the wage earner without using a dramatic law. It taxes through dilution, and then the system needs debt to keep the machine alive. This is where the gambler's logic becomes the state's logic. You do not get growth by producing more value at the same pace forever. You can also get growth by expanding credit, stretching future consumption into the present. That works until it doesn't. Modern economies are built on leverage. Governments issue debt, corporations issue debt, people issue debt. When interest rates are low, everyone pretends debt is harmless. Borrowing becomes a lifestyle. Financing becomes normal. Nobody asks what happens when the cost of money rises, because nobody wants to imagine the moment when belief breaks. But belief always breaks eventually. Not because the universe hates you personally, because the balance sheets eventually hit arithmetic. When the central bank tightens, the bubble doesn't merely deflate, it resets the distribution of wealth by force. Asset prices correct. Companies with thin margins die or get bought cheaply. Homeowners who borrowed at the wrong time discover that monthly payments are no longer fantasies. People sell at losses to survive. The crowd becomes desperate, and desperation is the most profitable sales environment for the wealthy who had liquidity. This is the part of the bubble story people refuse to face. Crises are not only failures, they are redistribution mechanisms. The system cleans house and then feeds the remains to predators who were ready. You don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to see it. The incentives explain it. The structure produces it. Now look at the modern landscape with new eyes. You see low-quality companies surviving on cheap borrowed capital while showing losses that would crush them in a world without easy funding. You see real estate prices decoupling from wages, rising beyond any normal household income because credit makes it possible to bid past reality. You see speculative assets like cryptocurrencies surge by pure belief, where charts become sermons and volatility becomes a thrill instead of a warning. And you see how quickly mainstream narratives adapt. They call it innovation. They call it adoption. They call it the future. But the future is only future as long as belief stays strong enough to attract new buyers. That's Mississippi again, with digital trading and slicker marketing. So what will the next bubble look like when it bursts? It will not announce itself with a banner. It will not feel like a movie ending. It will feel like confusion and incremental pain, punctuated by sudden panic. First, savings lose value. If you hoard cash long enough, inflation erodes it. You might have thought cash was safety because you can count it. But cash is a problem.